Thank you so much, Peter. Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here today with you this morning, delighted to talk to the audience present today, and delighted to talk to the audience present online. My name's Deborah Robinson, and I'm delighted for another reason as well, which is that I get to speak with my much esteemed colleague, Lisha O'Sullivan from Mary Immaculate College. So we're here to share with you some of the initial findings from our independent evaluation of the NCSE's frontline services, and the focus of this study has been perceptions of key actors and stakeholders in the system. What we really hope is that the account that we share with you of our findings echoes with your own experiences, has some resonance with you, but also we've tried to present our findings and work this research study so that it brings some challenges and some new insights and some stimulation for further work. Now, I realise that some people in the audience may not be able to see me, so I shall do my best to explain what I look like. Unfortunately, the description will not sound like a description of Angelina Jolie, a famous, beautiful woman, because unlike her, I'm a rather small, slightly plump, blonde-haired, spiky-haired woman who people say looks kind and approachable. And I'm with my colleague Lisha, who is much taller, much younger and more slender than me, and has shoulder-length auburn hair. And people say about Lisha that when they see her, she looks serene and calm. So that's what we look like. So I come from the University of Derby, where I'm a research professor in special needs and disability over in England, and I've had a career-long interest in inclusive practice for special needs and particularly in mainstream provision, and I have found my learning about the system in Ireland to be very stimulating and exciting too. So I'll just step aside so my colleague Lisha can tell you a bit about herself.
Thanks, Debs. My name is Lisha O'Sullivan, and I'm based in the Department of Reflective Pedagogy and Early Childhood Studies in Mary Immaculate College, and my research interests are in early years, playful pedagogy and inclusive education, and since meeting Debs, participatory research methods with children and young people. So thank you, Debs.
Thank you, Lisha. So what was the core research question for the study that we're going to talk to you about today? Well, it was, what's the impact of NCSE's frontline services on young people, pupils, and so on? And we talked to a range of stakeholders, parent carers being a key stakeholder group, pupils themselves, school staff, and we also engaged members of the NCSE's own staff. So we were interested in impacts of those services on well-being, on quality of education, on inclusion, and we also explored issues around communication and cross-sectoral collaborative working. And in terms of timing, as Peter explained, we were commissioned to start this research in September 22, and the report is due to be complete. The first draft is due to be complete in December, so you'll see publication in 2024. We're still in the process of refining our interpretation of the findings, so researchers don't like to let go of their data until the very last minute. So you might find there are some small differences between the report that you read in the future and some of the findings that we're talking to you about today. Oh, and also to mention that the study was done by the University of Derby Consortium, which involved researchers from my university, the University of Derby, also Mary Immaculate College, and also a research company called IFF Research in London, in England, who are really good at large-scale surveys. So what do we mean by frontline services in this study? Well, of course, we mean those services delivered by the NCSE, which are most visible in the day-to-day interactions of parents, pupils, and schools, their day-to-day interaction with the NCSE. So, of course, we're talking about things like the Special Educational Needs Officer, the Visiting Teacher Service, teacher professional development, and so on. How did we do the study? Well, we did use quite a complex research design, because what we really wanted to do was to hear from as many participants as possible, whilst also hearing some of the richer, deeper stories they told us about their interactions with the NCSE's frontline services and the impacts they felt those services had. So you can see that the approach included an online survey for parents, carers, and for school staff, and we were pleased to have over 1,300 responses to this survey. We did in-depth semi-structured interviews with 33 people, and we also did in-depth case studies of 9 very varied schools, and most importantly, because it's the core of the business, we did case studies of 9 pupils to explore their experience, their perspective on the inclusiveness of their own education. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Lisha, who's going to talk to you in more detail about that aspect of the study.
So building on Emer's earlier points around the importance of seeing teachers as researchers, the project team were very keen to involve teachers in the case studies. And in doing that, we were hoping to eliminate that gap between those who generate research and those who apply research in practice, essentially seeing teachers becoming generators rather than consumers of research. And when we involve teachers in this type of evaluation research, their expertise and their experience really informs policy development. Also, as researchers, we can be a little bit removed from practice, and through having teachers involved with us as researchers, they just brought a closeness to practice that we did not have, which was very valuable and gave them credibility in field work sites. So with the help of our colleague, Dr. Joe Fitzgerald in Mary Immaculate College, we were very lucky to recruit 6 fantastic teacher researchers to work with us on this project. They were post-primary teachers and primary teachers. They were qualified teachers. They had master's qualifications in inclusive or special education, and all 6 were currently working in special education. And of course, we're very grateful as well to their schools for releasing them to work with us on the project. So Emer and I, at the beginning of our engagement with the teacher researchers, we were very keen to get a sense of where they were coming from. So we conducted interests and capabilities and concerns evaluation with them. And I suppose that really paved the foundation for us to build this teacher researcher preparation program in collaboration with them. And we really drew on the principles of universal design for learning when designing the program as well. As you can see, it was 5 sessions. We had a blend of synchronous and asynchronous content, and really collaborated around scheduling and that type of thing with our teacher researchers, who of course were very busy in their regular school roles as well. So on the next slide, we have just an overview of the methods that we use to collect data during the case studies. And again, we adopted a collaborative approach here with our teacher researchers, and we really tried to co-create the instrumentation with them. So Emer and I, with the project team and the National Council, would draft initial instruments, and then we would get feedback from our teacher researchers. And in the case of the participation encounters with children and young people, they tried out those methods in their own school context, and that was really valuable. So then after that collaborative development of instruments, we collated everything in a teacher researcher handbook. And I know we have a lot to say about that, and hopefully we'll get opportunities in the future, but today we're just going to say a little bit about the participatory encounters with children and young people. So I suppose this was how we approach capturing pupil voice, and it was making that very central to the case studies. And what we wanted to find out really was, how are children and young people experiencing school? What's supporting their education? What's working out well for them? is there anything that's not working out so well for them? So we had a flexible approach to data capture here, but this image gives you a rough idea of the process of engaging children and young people in those participatory encounters. So to introduce the idea of mapping, I suppose, as a medium through which we can represent experiences, places, things that are important to us. Teacher researchers choose between my map book and the Map Art Lab book, depending on children and young people's interests and their age. That's kind of set the basis for moving on then to engage in making a map with the child or young person. Then the teacher or researcher engaged each pupil in a conversation about their map using focus prompts, which we had collaboratively developed as well. And as a final option, there was a walking tour that children and young people could take their teacher researcher on if they wanted to. So that just gives a flavour, and we'll come back to the maps further on.
Thank you, Lisa. And I have to say, MIC did a fantastic job of the case studies of schools, and those case studies are going to result in some fantastic stories that will be educative for all of us. Okay, so what were the findings of our research? So one of the things to say is that we're reporting our findings thematically, which gives us an opportunity to represent the complexity of interacting factors that construct perceptions of the NCSE's frontline services. And we use magnitude descriptors like all meaning 100%, most being 76% and over, a majority being between 51 and 75%. Just so you know, you can get a gauge on what we mean when we're talking about all, majority, most. Okay, so the next slide, I'll describe what it looks like first. The next slide shows the thematic map for the findings. So there are 4 major themes across the top, and they are impact as perceived by stakeholders. The second major theme across the top is communication and relationships as mediators of sentiment. The third is the right support in the right place at the right time. And the last is collaboration and misunderstanding, with the miss part in brackets. Also under the major themes are 2 or 3 sub-themes. So what we're going to do is we're going to take you through the findings with reference to this thematic map, so we can keep everyone following the structure of our findings and make it accessible to you. So let's start with theme number 1, the impact as perceived by stakeholders. And there are 2 sub-themes for this theme. The first is descriptions of impact, and the second is, very interesting phenomenon, process schema dominant over impact schema. So let's look at descriptions of impact. So in our surveys of parent carers, we found that the majority of parent carers responding to the survey did see NCSE frontline services as providing significant benefit to their child. When we asked them about which services were making the impact, they identified the visiting teacher service, school transport, additional resources, and the allocation of additional staff and home tuition. And the majority of parents also reported that the CNO had supported them and their child well. Parents carers also explained in the survey that some of those impacts were around improved access to education, some of them were around improved educational process, and some of them were around improved well-being. The VTS and the CNO were also considered by the majority of parents in their role in reviewing and allocating special needs assistance to be leading to improved inclusion. And you can see a quotation, or there is a quotation from the data in the survey, parents talking about the huge impact that their child being able to attend a mainstream school with his or her peers has had on his development. When we talk to school staff, we found that where a subset of respondents were saying that they had had interaction with NCSE services, it was a minority who were describing impacts like knowledge of how to support learners with special needs, confidence, and the development of methods and processes that would be more inclusive. Impact was also described by participants in interviews. They talked positively about the impact of NCSE frontline services on the progress of their children and their enjoyment of school, and even parents who were being very critical of processes they'd encountered acknowledged the progress they had made because of the NCSE's frontline services and what they had either directly delivered or enabled. There's a speech bubble on the slide which contains the words of one parent carer who's talking about how a visit from an NC advisor helped to change an attitude of a teacher towards her child's rather untidy drawing and writing, and this led to her child having a changed attitude to writing and a desire to write a book. Interestingly, this parent was also a teacher, so perhaps the visibility of that impact was clearer to her. So in terms of the case studies, Lisa will tell you what other impacts we were able to discern from our engagement with participants.
Thanks, Deb. So just to look at the impact from that perspective of children and young people, we have a beautiful map here, which was drawn by a pupil who was 14 years of age, attending a post-primary mainstream school with an assessment of mild general learning disability. So as you can see from the excerpt there on the slide, this child, a young person, described how they have less withdrawal time from classes in post-primary school than in primary school, and how this has helped their confidence as they feel more included. So just to take you on a quick tour around the map, over here, number 1 is me arriving to my locker in the morning and getting organised and meeting with my friends. Number 2 is me in class with my friends. Number 3 is me taking a movement break with my SNA. And number 4 is my favourite place, being outside with my friends at lunch. So I think that really captures a sense of, being included in the school, of belonging and being fully participating fully and being in no way restricted. So this student again spoke about really liking subjects like SPHE, subjects where you get to learn interesting things and talk about them with your friends, subjects where you get to do practical, hands-on things like gardening, and also that opportunity to be included and involved in extracurricular activities such as the school show. So in this map and across many of the maps that we have, it's quite profound how that, socially mediated nature of learning is so important to children and young people, as evidenced by the dominance of peers and of school staff in the maps. And also I think the learning environment, we can see through the maps that that's really important to children and young people who participated, and that chimes with the Reggio Emilia approach in northern Italy, which identifies the environment as the child's third teacher. So hopefully that gives a flavour of how the maps really can capture that impact on children and young people. And we'll return to this case study a little bit later on to look further at impact.
And I think the thing to emphasise also is that we see in all of the case studies of children positive stories of inclusion. So though the adults around the pupils may be struggling, may be experiencing frustrations, something good is the outcome of that, and it's the inclusion of these children. Now, okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is a really interesting phenomenon in our data. And what we found when we interacted with these 1,400 participants is that when they told us their stories, these stories were dominated by what we call process schema rather than impact schema. So what do we mean by this? So we're really talking about mental models, cognitive models that come into play when people are talking about their experiences. What we found was that people talked more, kept wanting to talk more about processes, such as the application for the additional support, putting in a ticket for the NCSE advisory service, the early engagement and relationships with people in the NCSE and what those were like, and some of the turbulences that came from those experiences. So it was hard for us as researchers to get our participants talking about impact. We did, you've just seen we did, but there's something happening here around a process schema being dominant. Now, we're not sure why it's dominant. It might be because over the past 2 decades, as Emma has so lucidly explained, it might be that Ireland has been implementing a revolutionary educational change, and so the focus has been on strategy, implementation and process. It might be because people's emotions come into it, and what they remember is the frustration of the form that they had to fill in, or the encounter that they had that wasn't very satisfying. And so later, when we come to talk about, for example, bureaucracy as a mediated sentiment, we think there are some potential explanations. So the question for the sector is, would it be fruitful to move towards an impact culture, to move towards the dominance of an impact culture over a process culture? What would that gain us, and what would we need to do to achieve that? So in terms of communicators and relationships as mediators of sentiment, we found some very important things. So what we mean by this theme is as follows. When participants were being positive about NCSE services and about the impact of those services, they were usually at the same time describing positive, personalised, supportive relationships. So in the data, one claim we would make is that there is a relationship between people's experience of a relationship with NCSE staff and the way they perceive the service and its impact. So let's have a look for a moment at the critical role of the CNO. So the Special Educational Needs Officer was identified by parent carers as a service that did lead to positive impacts, because it was the CNO that helped you find that placement, that helped you access that additional support. But then when the child was in school, later on, we found in our interviews that CNOs were mentioned rarely. And you would expect that, wouldn't you? Because you would expect the relationship to transition into a relationship with the school and the interaction with the school and school staff over the inclusion of the child. With school staff, we found that school staff were really clear that the CNO role was crucial to their school's success in gaining additional resources. Sentiments about the CNO role were mixed, but positive sentiments arose when the member of school staff, the principal, the class teacher, the SENCO, had had a good relationship with their CNO. And school staff talked about how much they relied on their CNO. They thought that that in some ways was a good thing, and in other ways was a little bit risky. So here's a couple of examples. So on this slide we have 2 speech bubbles with word for word text from people that we interviewed. So in the first bubble, the participant is talking about how wonderful her CNO was. And I think the thing to notice here is that the participant says, my CNO is very supportive and advises me with the paperwork that I submit, and it doesn't mean I always get them, resources that is, but I don't want to miss out on anything that I'm entitled to. So here we see that a good relationship with the CNO helps a member of school staff be resilient to the disappointment that might come from an unsuccessful application. The speech bubble underneath that is a member of school staff talking about how you really hope you're going to get the best CNO who's really good and has really strong relationships with school because you rely on them so much. And I know at the moment the NCSE is in the process of recruiting 40 new CNOs and will be bearing these findings in mind when creating selection criteria. So the next thing to talk about is how important personalised relationships were. So you can hear me repeating myself now, can't you? When participants were positive about NCSE services, it was because they had experienced relationships that involved prolonged contact with a service or an individual in that service, a continuous responsive relationship, something that felt personalised. When participants felt less positive, it was because they didn't experience these kinds of relationships. And I think a really important message for all of us is that school staff and parent carers are longing for more face-to-face contact. It's the people-to-people work that seems to be so important to perceptions among the actors in the system. Communication, under the theme Communication, Relationships as a Mediator of Sentiment, people were telling us stories that represented a continuum of communication that was responsive to communication that left you feeling like you were all alone. So when communication was good, it was easy, it was timely, it was face-to-face, it was person-to-person. When communication led to a feeling of isolation, it was because you felt like you were struggling alone, you were being sent from pillar to post, and nobody got back to you. Really important for us to say that there was a continuum of these experiences. And here's a couple of examples. So there's 2 speech bubbles on the continuum from responsive to isolating, and someone here, a school principal, is talking about how in touch with the school the CNO is, how responsive the CNO is, and how quickly they get back to the school. On the other hand, we've got someone talking about feeling like there's nobody picking up the phone and they don't know who to speak to. And I think Lisa has a couple of insights from the case studies to share with you too.
Thanks, Debs. Again, the pattern in the case study data seems to be quite similar. You can see there in one speech bubble how a parent reports gaining so much confidence from knowing that there is a real positive relationship between the school and the NCSE, and that means that their child gets the support that they need. Again, the CNO being seen very much as the face of the NCSE, and as Debs has articulated, the importance of that. And then, an excerpt that perhaps illustrates where sometimes when communication is not optimal, it can impact negatively on relationships. So to move on to our next theme, the right support in the right place at the right time, we're going to return to our case study that we looked at earlier to begin looking at this theme before we move on to look at perceptions of sufficiency and insufficiency and bureaucracy as a mediator of sentiment. Okay, so to return to our earlier case study, and just to illustrate how cumulatively a range of NCSE services are enabling this young person to attend mainstream post-primary school and to engage in a level 2 learning program. So stakeholders report, the importance of, engaging with the NCSE website. They use guidelines for developing plans. They speak about the important role of the NCSE advisor in, engaging them in continuing professional learning around inclusive and differentiated pedagogical approaches. They talk about the importance of the support from the advisor in cascading that learning throughout the school so that all teachers working with the student can benefit from that advice. And then, of course, the CNO, who's pivotal in supporting the school in securing resources such as assistive technology, which supports learning, but also supports cohesion between the school and the home learning environment, and the SNA, in this instance, who functions to support the student engaging in their work competently with support, who helps them to get organised and to follow their timetable, who allows them the opportunity to take those movement breaks when they feel anxious and when they need them. So again, there is a sense from this particular case study that without all of these supports, that level 2 learning program in particular would have been very challenging to put in place, and perhaps this student may not have been able to engage in their mainstream post-primary placement without as I said, all these supports coming in behind teachers and families and the student. And I suppose, again, just a note on that case study that one thing that was really strong was the fact that particularly continuing professional learning, that it benefits all pupils in the school, not just children with special educational needs. So then moving on to perceptions of sufficiency and insufficiency of support. It seems from our look at the data already that these perceptions of sufficiency and insufficiency are mediated by levels of need and levels of support. So again, where there is a perception that the level of support is well matched to the level of need, then school staff feel confident in their ability to fulfil their role and support the inclusion and educational progress of children and young people, while when they believe that the needs are greater than the support, that can cause anxiety, dissatisfaction, and I suppose cause less confidence in their ability to fulfill that role. And there's just two bubbles there that give an example from both sides of the coin of that huge confidence boost at the NCSE gives to stakeholders, and then that maybe feeling a little bit overwhelmed when the needs continue to rise very rapidly. So moving on then to looking at bureaucracy as a mediator of sentiment. So there was a sense across the case studies that where stakeholders perceive administrative processes to be very complicated, that this certainly contributes to a negative sentiment. So just a couple of points there, administrative load. So that making of applications as being very time consuming, liaising with the NCSE and NEPS and other organisations as being an additional time burden. Navigating the online application system. While some participants found it easy to navigate, others found it challenging, and this could be a deterrent to making applications. And there was also comments around maybe having some human interaction in that process. Transparency, around decision making. So that's, there seemed to be just a little bit of confusion and uncertainty around who actually makes decisions about resources. And interestingly, in some case studies, the CNO was seen as having too much decision making responsibility, while in others, they were seen as not having enough decision making responsibility. And the engagement in decision making, so a sense that sometimes decisions are made very distal to the child or young person's school context, and that kind of desire to be more involved, particularly a pattern where SNAs suggest they'd like to be involved, given that they spend the most time with the students in their schools and classes. The impact then of administrative processes on planning. So some of these case studies were conducted in May, June, and I think, at that point, many were awaiting the outcomes of exceptional reviews. So as you can see in the speech bubble from case study 3, there was a sense of anxiety around next year, around planning, and, staff maybe being uncertain in terms of their employment for the year ahead as well. And also, I suppose, a perception that sometimes there can be a delay between when you request resources and when you receive them. And to take the example of a child or a young person who's engaging in behaviours of concern, that this can have an impact on the student themselves, their peers, their teachers, and their families. So, Debs, you have some more findings to share on that.
So we're nearly at the end, everyone, and I'm looking at Peter and thinking that he's very strict but fair, so I shall have to be a little more prompt and a bit quicker. So, just to give you a flavour before we get to the summary of our findings, our interim findings, it's quite clear from the data that the visiting teacher service is highly valued by school staff and by parents' carers. I think this might be because the visiting teacher service includes the parents and the school, and is a prolonged experience, a prolonged relationship. And you can see a comment by a participant about how outstanding the visiting teacher is. And I think the thing to note in this quotation is the following phrase: every child needs a visiting teacher in their corner to help them. As a parent, it's very overwhelming to always to be struggling to navigate the school system. So parent carers, what matters to them is a key worker, a person in their corner. The NCSE advisory service is also highly valued by school staff, who see that service as being delivered by people with expertise and providing relevant support. So finally, the fourth theme, which is called collaboration and misunderstanding, with the miss in brackets. What we found was that participants feel that there's a lack of trust and a lot of tension in the system. So, for example, special needs has become a political football. I don't know whether that makes sense to you, but that's what our participants were telling us. It had the attention of the media, and NCSE staff and school staff felt quite exposed by that. And there was kind of a lack of trust, principals felt, and that everyone was kind of confused about where one set of responsibilities ended and the other began. Actually, that's probably a good sign, because that's what collaboration involves. But it seemed to be a preoccupation for participants. But everybody, almost everyone we interacted with, had a real desire for a system that was more mutually trusting, that was more collaborative, so that our system could get to the stage that Emma talked about in her presentation, the most difficult stage, the stage of cross-sectoral working, trust and collaboration. And parents would love to feel more included and at the centre of all the conversations about their child. Now, participants also suggest, when they were trying to be helpful, some ways that we could move forward. So you've already heard that the majority of participants recognised positive impact from these services, but there was a general sense that the NCSE might have a bit of public relations work to do, so that all stakeholders knew its remit, knew its mission, and so that there was a growing culture of communication and trust. So finally, what are our tentative interim conclusions on participants' perceptions of the impact of NCSE's frontline services? I apologise for the text being so small. I'll summarise. The majority of parents valued the support they got and the impact that was gained from NCSE's frontline services, and they mentioned impacts on well-being, access to education, inclusion and progress. School staff valued those services. They valued a number of those services, almost all the services: the VTS, the advisory service, the website, the school portal, teacher professional development services and additional resources. Although they did have lots of ideas about how those could improve. and we'll include those in our reports. Some services were very highly valued, and the senior role was considered crucial. The thing that we saw was that people knew that there was a lot of expertise in the NCSE that was of huge value to them, but would love there to be more sufficiency in that. And we saw from NCSE staff real engagement and commitment. Now, this is where we think the business is. So these are the phenomena of interest in our data set. First, this phenomenon of process schema, a focus on processes being dominant over impact schema, a focus on impact. The second is that communication and relationships emerged as real mediators of sentiment. And the third is that bureaucracy was a real mediator of sentiment. So we might suggest in our final report, or we might indicate that we think that these are where the action should be. Finally, areas for development, well, you've already heard those. They're around communication, they're around relationships, they're around the importance of increasing face-to-face contact. They're also about a move towards reducing bureaucratic burden and creating a collaborative system. We also mentioned public relationships, and parent carers certainly want to be more involved. We end with a set of speech bubbles from our survey that show what happens when the right support is in the right place at the right time. This is what we want. We want pupils in schools to be experiencing the inclusive education system that everyone has been working for the past few decades. So, for example, one parent carer mentions, "My child is happier and doing much better because he's now able to access the curriculum more successfully." And NCSE frontline services have emerged as implicated in those positive outcomes. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.